Hi, I'm Julie Hedgepeth Williams. I'll be reading from my book, A Rare Titanic Family, which is about my great uncle, Albert Caldwell, here the man holding a baby, and his wife Sylvia and their baby Alden, all three of whom survived the Titanic. Uncle Al, as I called him, was 26 at the time and he lived to be 91, and I knew him well, so this story came largely from him. Albert Francis Caldwell, 26, shifted his baby son to one side and peered over the steep side of the ship into nothing. He could see the vertical hull as it slithered into empty darkness, but he couldn't even make out the water below. It was utterly black, void, and, well, puzzling. With baby Alden squirming against the cold night air, Albert wondered why they would be putting women and children off in the lifeboats. Albert tested the ship beneath his feet, one of those things you do unconsciously every time you step on deck. But this time he thought of it. It was, as his unconscious feet always read it, solid. It wasn't listing. Clearly the ship could not be in any danger. If it were sinking, he'd have tripped over a sloping floor. He'd have heard the rush of water or the screams of panic, all those things you'd imagine would be evident on a sinking ship. Not one was happening. Clearly, he thought a little crossly, this was a case of overcautious behavior that could result in raw tragedy. Put women and children off in an open boat into an ocean blacker than coal? What a stupid idea. Albert's thought flew to his wife, Sylvia May Harbaugh Caldwell, 28, and to the little son, Alden, who in his arms, who had turned 10 months old just 4 days before. No, 5 days, as surely it was now after midnight. Sylvia was getting over a dire illness and was prone to nausea. If she got into an open boat in the Atlantic, she'd become seasick. And the baby? Their precious Alden was small enough to need constant attention, and at this sleepy hour of the night they hadn't been able to find the key to their trunk, and Alden's warm things were locked in the trunk. Thus the baby was wrapped in a steamer rug. It was warm enough, but it was not his own little coat. Sylvia couldn't even hold the baby properly, owing to the illness she was still battling. The thought of putting the baby on a lifeboat in the bitter cold without his coat when his seasick mother couldn't really hang on to him, well, it was preposterous. It was obvious to Albert what they needed to do. He had made his decision. He would not put his wife and child off on a lifeboat. They would stay on the Titanic. In 2.5 short years of his married life and career, Albert Francis Caldwell had worn various hats: husband, missionary, teacher, father. On this unforgivingly bitter April night in the North Atlantic Ocean, he was looking at the situation entirely as a good husband and father, protecting his wife and child. What he didn't realize, as he shivered to a decision in the darkness, was that the hat he needed to be wearing that night was his missionary one. Because at the moment of that fatal decision, what the Caldwell family needed more than a husband or a daddy was a guardian angel, a sweaty, grimy guardian angel covered in coal dust. Now, the Caldwells had been missionaries in Siam, so we're going to jump back in time to when they were fleeing their jobs in Siam. We call Siam Thailand today. They actually fled their jobs before they wound up on the Titanic. And so we're going to go back in time to see where they got there. The Titanic was well hyped. By now, the Caldwells had heard all the soaring adjectives and mighty claims. Most marvelous in Albert's mind was the fact that the Titanic was unsinkable. They had apparently heard a sales pitch. Watertight compartments which could be closed would render the boat absolutely secure and non-sinkable. So we were told, Albert recalled later. Sylvia was skeptical that the ship was really unsinkable. Not that her skepticism dimmed the excitement. A friend accompanied them from London with a camera, ready to photograph such a remarkable ship. Everyone wanted to see the fine ocean liner, and their friend was surely pleased to have an excuse to get on board as he saw them off. At dockside, they watched the porters moving luggage, including their own. Albert probably would not have handled their luggage anyway. They were moving up in the world, after all, and would have used a porter. But in this case, it was imperative. He had to carry Alden, as Sylvia was still ailing and could not. Sylvia did, however, turn to a porter, anxious to satisfy that nagging question about the claim that she didn't quite believe. "Is this ship really non-sinkable?" she asked. He replied, "Yes, lady. God himself could not sink this ship." Best of all, there was that enormous ship which offered so many curiosities to investigate. I enjoyed going all down inside the boat, exploring it, this great vessel, Albert later recalled. Other passengers might be enjoying amenities such as the gymnasium or the swimming pool, but he wanted to see where the real action was. While Sylvia stayed in the cabin with Alden one day, recuperating and letting Alden nap, Albert headed out to see the engine room. He convinced someone, one of the crewmen, to give him a behind-the-scenes tour. It wasn't too hard. Albert was a glib talker. He and the crewman made their way down, past the areas where passengers normally visited, and into the realm of the crew only. Albert was privileged to be there, which he relished. What things to see! The engines! Remarkable! He saw 2 big engines and 1 small one, probably a steam turbine. Albert was fascinated with the sweaty, grimy stokers, busy feeding the boilers by tossing coal into the fires with their shovels. He asked if he could take their picture and, in fact, if he could make the ship go, too, by tossing coal into the fire. The stokers were amused by his interest and even more amused when this schoolteacher wanted a photo of himself shoveling coal. Albert introduced himself and set his camera up on his tripod before he posed with a stoker's shovel, perhaps that of Frederick Barrett. Someone snapped the picture as the stokers egged him on. They loved this attention. To Albert, it was fun. Dirty, hot, and really fun. This was a rare moment on the segregated Titanic. Normally, a passenger would contact the crew only insofar as the crew served the passenger. Passengers conversed with stokers and shovel coal? Not normally. But that was Albert. He had worked with people in Siam who would have been thought downtrodden and ignorant by the average American. Albert liked those people, and he liked these stokers too. He made an impression on the stokers, an impression that ultimately saved his life. Now we're going to skip to April 14th, on the night of the sinking. Albert took a walk around the deck before bed, a pleasant, if arctic way to unwind. It was the kind of night that would make anyone want to snuggle under a warm blanket. They went to bed about 10 o'clock. As Sylvia said, the night was cold. She underlined cold, so we went to bed to keep warm. Albert climbed into his top bunk, and Sylvia and Alden crawled into the lower bunk. Albert liked the upper bunk. Situated midair as it was, it vibrated soothingly in the rhythm of the engines. Soon he was peacefully asleep. For Sylvia, with the baby in her bed, it was not quite so peaceful. Anyone sharing a bed with a baby is by definition a light sleeper. As Alden wiggled and called out and fretted in his sleep, she hurriedly soothed him back to quietness. The baby was restless, and as a result, she was dozing lightly at 11:40 when she felt a sudden shudder of the ship. It felt to her as if a large dog had a baby kitten in its mouth and was shaking it. "Albert," she called softly, trying to wake him up without waking Alden. Albert woke without realizing Sylvia had been calling him. He would later say he was awakened by the sheer stillness of the ship. The bed no longer hummed with its soothing vibrations. It was like riding a Pullman sleeper, he thought. The click, click, click of the rails blended into a mass of pleasing noise that shut out the world. But you woke up when that rhythm stopped. This was the same. He knew instantly that the engines had stopped, but unlike passengers in that Pullman sleeper, the passengers on the Titanic were not at their destination yet. What in the world would the engines stop for at this time of night, he wondered. He got up and threw his raincoat over his pajamas and went out onto deck. He spotted a sailor looking over into the water. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Oh," the sailor said casually, "we've just bumped into an iceberg. It didn't do any harm, I guess." "I should think we had, from the chill of the atmosphere," Albert replied. Albert went back into the cabin and told Sylvia about the iceberg in a quiet voice, so as not to awaken Alden, and crawled back to the top bunk to go back to sleep. Albert drifted off again for the last few moments of peace he would know for many days. Sylvia, however, could not go back to sleep. "I was nervous and wakeful and could not sleep, and it was well that this was true," she recalled later, because she heard a gong ring and a seaman running by and shouting, "Everyone on deck with his life belt!" He was running too fast. "If Sylvia hadn't been awake, I would never have heard him," she said. Luckily, another crewman followed the first, pounding on the cabin door. "Everybody on deck," he yelled. "Everybody on deck with your life belt." "We were astounded," Albert recalled later. He was not surprised, however, that after the crew called for women and children to get aboard, that women and children were not interested. The Titanic was clearly not in any real trouble. He was sure of that. From Albert's Midwestern point of view, it was a risky thing for women to take to small boats in mid-ocean when most had no strength for nor experience in rowing, and some would be required to tend children rather than tend oars. It seemed like a quick trip to disaster. They, the women and children, didn't want to run this chance, Albert explained. And how well he and Sylvia recalled her seasickness. Surely such seasickness would be exacerbated in an open boat. Albert looked over the side of the Titanic into the blackness, keeping Alden in his arms well away from the steep side of the ship. The baby would be in constant danger in a small open boat, especially if his seasick mother, still hobbled in some fashion due to neurasthenia, had to hold him. The sailors were calling for women and children, but the simple fact was that Sylvia would not be able to hold the baby with confidence and with ease. Back in Illinois, William and Fanny Caldwell, Albert's parents, were worrying about their son and daughter-in-law and the grandchild they had never met. They knew, no doubt, that Sylvia was struggling with her health and that she suffered from seasickness. That evening, as they were getting ready for bed, William and Fanny Caldwell got down on their knees for their regular evening devotions and prayed for the safe return of their son and his family. Albert was not wearing his missionary hat on the night of the sinking, and so, he always thought, it was his parents' prayers that caused what happened next. As Albert and Sylvia were wavering over whether to put Sylvia and Alden into a lifeboat, a cluster of stokers appeared on the deck where the Caldwells now were. Sweaty, covered in grime, and some of them wet with seawater, the men looked like they had been toiling in hell. But for the Caldwells, one of these men was surely their guardian angel, sent, as Albert saw it later, by his parents' anxious prayers. Albert was surprised when one of the stokers, perhaps Frederick Barrett, George Beauchamp, James Cremens, or William Major, looked firmly at him and addressed him by name. "Mr. Caldwell." It was one of the stokers he had met that day that he had taken photographs of the great ship's furnaces. The stoker approached, clearly giving Albert an order. "If you value your life, get off this ship," he said. "I've been below, and the hold is filling up with water, and this ship is going to sink. The ocean is pouring in much faster than the pump can keep up." The other stokers seconded him by adding, "This boat's going to sink. There is water rushing into the hold below." These were startling warnings. The deck was still solid beneath their feet. The Titanic was still unsinkable. The watertight doors were still open in nonchalant tribute to the lack of danger. At least Albert thought they were. But there was the unmistakable and worrisome truth that women and children were indeed off in the lifeboats, and crewmen who ought to know the truth were insisting they get off. Albert had been below where these stokers worked, and he could picture the hole that they said was now filling with water. Albert was trying to balance the dire pictures the stokers painted against the sturdy deck beneath him. Albert apparently protested to one of the stokers that the Titanic was so much safer than a lifeboat. It was so big and so strongly constructed that he didn't believe she would sink. Surely she would float for hours, even days. The stoker doggedly offered an alternative. "Get your family off the boat. If it is still here in the morning, you can get back on." Suddenly that made sense to Albert. Many years later he would look back on that moment and say, "I don't know why I believe him." Then he'd pause and add, "I'll always be thankful for praying parents." The stoker pointed out Lifeboat 13 right at hand. He sprinted to the gangway door and saw the boat still had room. He called to the men above who were lowering the boat to hold it. Sylvia and Albert reacted instinctively. The boat had stopped specifically for them, so they dropped all of their questions and hurried to it. And the stokers, about a dozen of them, and a few other men passengers, my wife and myself, got in boat number 13, Albert summarized years later, thus adding Siam to the worldwide sprinkling of nations represented in Lifeboat 13. I do hope you'll read the whole thing. I appreciate New South Books giving everybody the entertainment of authors reading, and if you want to contact me, please contact New South Books, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.